All right, so we'll say good morning. Let us begin by thanking our sponsors. Thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat, the Elba Mishpacha, for dedicating all the Shirm and Drashos this month in memory of beloved husband and father Jerry, Yaakov Couple ben Avram Menachem. To thank Mrs. Bracha Strimber for dedicating all the Shirm and Drashos this month in loving memory of her husband Avi, Avram ben Kalman Eliezer Halevi. And to thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Semia Malka Esterson, in memory of a dear friend, Sam Pollock, Shmuel Menachem ben Arav Yaakov Tuvia, a man larger than life, full of happiness, humor, and goodness, who left our world on Sunday, the 25th of Shvat, after a valiant health struggle for the Olam HaEmes. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, and the families a nechama. And Abossi, with that, let us begin. We have an exciting daf ahead of us today, and hopefully, time permitting, a little bit of halacha lamaisa as well. Today's daf is daf pei, page 80. We are picking up Eretz Hashem on Ayin Tesam with days 79b. Abossi, let's pick up. I believe we left off 4 lines into the wide lines. Right after the period, it's Ularav Lalishna Kamad Rav Kahana. So we'll say, if you remember again, just to reorient ourselves for a bit, and again, I do hope to get to the Rambam Hilchos Pesach today because there's a lot of great halacha lamaisa. So we'll say, if you remember again, we had a fascinating, really riveting case of Mechza Mechza. So remember again, we know we've been learning the halachos ultimately again of Klal Yisrael becoming Tamei. So now we spoke about the case of Mechza al Mechza. What happens in a situation where halacha l'maaseh 50% of the Klal is Tamei, 50% of the Klal is Tar? What happens under those circumstances? So remember again, Rav said we treat it ultimately again as Mechza al Mechza, meaning what? That essentially you have 2 Korban Pesachs, two groups. The Tar group does the Pesach on their own. The Tamei group does the Pesach on their own. That's it. Rav Kana say 2 versions. So in version number one, Rav said as follows. Rav said that halacha l'maisa mechza is not kirov, right? Essentially, there's no majority. So what happens? So therefore, again, the Tahar people do it on Pesach Rishon, Tamei people do it on Pesach Sheni. In the alternate version or secondary version of Rav Kahana is again Tahorin do Pesach Rishon, and the Tameim don't do Rishon or Sheni, right? They don't do Rishon because there's no rov, and they don't do Sheni because they're not a miut. Okay, so those are the 2 versions. So says the Gemara, the Rav Ulalishna Kamad Rav Kahana. So also remember again, we're contrasting the shitas of Rav and Rav Kahana, different versions of Rav Kahana, ultimately with the Braisa. So Lishna Kama Ularav Lishna Kamad Rav Kahana Hadisanya, that which we learned Tahorin Osin as Harishon. So we'll say, what do you do with the Braisa that says that in Mechza, the Tahorin do Pesach Rishon, and the Tamein don't do Rishon and don't do Sheni? What's the case? So we'll say, how would they each touch up that case? So Rav Mataritzle, Rav would explain it as follows: Kigon Shal Yisrael Mechza Tameinu Mechza Tahorin, 50-50 case, but Nashim Otfos Ala Tahorin. But I will say it is in fact women who would cause the Tahorim to be the majority. Vikasavar, Nashim Berishon Chova. Again, according to this opinion, we would say that women have an obligation to perform Pesach Rishon, or B'Sheni Rishos, but Pesach Sheni is only optional. Berishon lo avdi dahavi limiut. So ultimately, again, they can't perform, right? So they can't perform Pesach Rishon, ultimately because they're a miut. Umiut lo avdi berishon, right? The Tamein are only a miut, therefore they can't do Pesach Rishon. Ubeshini lo avdi, but again, we also would not allow them to do Pesach Sheni. Why? Dal noshim minayhu, because remove women from the tally of the Tahorim. V'havilu palga, and it's mechza. Upalga lo avdi b'sheni, and 50% can't do Pesach Sheni. Okay, we'll say all we're doing over here is just trying to reconcile the different shitas with this braysa. Rav Kana damar palga nami avdi b'sheni echem mitaritzlei. But according to Rav Kana, who says that even 50% could do Pesach Sheni, how do you touch up the braysa? Okay, go and shal yisrael mechza Tahorin u'mechza tamein. Again, it's a case of mechza. V'noshim mashlimos l'Tahorin. And women count towards the tally, ultimately again of the Tahorim. V'kasabar nashim berishon chova u'b'sheni rishos. And according to this opinion, he'll say women are obligated on Pesach Rishon, but not on Pesach Sheni. Berishon lo avdi, salacha l'maisa, they won't perform Pesach Rishon. Why? Palga u'palga. Upal gabarishon lo avdi. Ultimately, again, because in this case, Shabbos say the tmeim are only mechza, they're only palga, and 50% tmeim can't do Pesach Rishon. B'sheni nami lo avdi can't do Pesach Sheni either. Why? Dal noshem minayu minator, because remove women from the tally of the tahorin, and therefore what? Havlu tmein ruba. Then Abba say that tmein would be the rov. The ruba lo avdi b'sheni, and the majority cannot perform Pesach Sheni. Rav Kahana hodisanya, but according to Rav Kahana Bosai, that's what you learned in the Brayso Yisrael Yisrael Mechza Tahorin and Mechza Tmein. First of the widest lines. Halalu osin liatzman, v'halalu osin liatzman. So we'll see. What about the following Brayso? This Brayso says if you have a 50-50 split, you essentially perform two different Karban Pesachs, right? There's a Karban Pesach for the Tar group, a Karban Pesach for the Tamei group. So the Gemara says, "Hey, how would Rav Kahana explain this?" Amar lecha Rav Kahana tanoihi. Rav Kahana would say it's machlokes tanoim. Ika leman damar mechza mechza kirov. Vika leman damar mechza mechza ein a kirov. So also Rav Kahana will say, in general, there's a machlokes tanoim. What's the machlokes tanoim? I will say, how do you deal with mechza al mechza? How do you look at mechza mechza? Is mechza al mechza like a rov, or is mechza u mechza not like a rov? Now I will say, now what I want to point out to you, by the way, is that halacha l'maisa, that in and of itself is at play in the two versions of Rav Kahana, right? Essentially, we said this yesterday, that how do, in terms of states, are there two states or three states? Is it mechza, is it rov and miut, or are there three states of rov, miut, and mechza? But again, so the Gemara also just machlokes tanoim. Good. Gufa, Harish Yisrael Mechza Tornu Mechza Tmein. So we'll say, so now let's go back and analyze something we learned before. You have a 50-50 split, right? We'll say this was the case we started with yesterday. So what's the halacha? Halalu osin yatzman, v'halalu osin yatzman. So we'll say, what do you do in this kind of case of Mechza Mechza? This is actually the Shita of Rav. You just perform two different Karban Pesach. So we'll say, you understand, I think I mentioned this yesterday, and I know you know it, but I'll say it anyway. When we say you perform two Karban Pesachs, of course, that's not literal. What it means is that year they'll perform two types of Karban Pesachs. Those who are Tahar will prepare their Karban Pesach B'tara, and those who are Tamei will prepare their Karban Pesach B'tuma. So, right, so obviously you'll have many Karbanos, but Lamaisa, the Karbanos will fall into these two camps. That's the position of Rav. So the Gemara says, We'll say what happens again if there are more Tamei people than Tahar people. Afilu echad. Even if the Tamei people outnumber the Tahar people by how many? One. What's the halacha? Yasu b'tuma. Then I both say again, even if there's one more Tamei person than Tahar person, the kahal is considered to be Tamei, and therefore halacha l'maisa they will do the Karban Pesach b'tuma lefi she'ein Karban tzibor chaluk. Because I both say at the end of the day, once the majority of the tzibor is in a certain state, the rest of the tzibor is pulled after that state. So even if you have a majority of one, the tzibor is considered to be Tamei. So you understand like the incredible drama in that. This isn't like a 51-49 split. I don't know whatever you call this. This is 49.999, or 49.9 against 50.1. So I'll say, but yet, amazingly enough, if the Tamei group is 50.1, that's it. The kal is Tamei, and ultimately we go ahead and perform the Karban Pesach b'tumah. So the Gemara says, good. Rabbi Elazar ben Masya Omer, Ein hayachid machriya es atzibur l'tumah. Both this is fascinating. Rabbi Elazar ben Masya says no, that does not work. The individual cannot. You can't declare a tamei majority based on one person. That does not work. Shnei Amar, what's I top of pay? Lo sucha lizboach es haPesach be'echad sha'arecha. So this is actually a great drasha. Rabbi Elazar ben Masya, now literally what that pasuk means is you can't offer up the Pesach in your backyard, be'echad sha'arecha, in one of your gates. You have to offer up the Pesach ultimately again in the Beis Hamikdash. Rabbi Elazar ben Masya darshans it a little bit. He says, Lo sucha lizboach es haPesach be'echad. You cannot go ahead and offer up the Pesach in a certain way because of one person. So in other words, if you have one more Tamei person than Tahar individuals, you can't offer up the Pesach betuma. That does not work. You need a majority. Rabbi Elazar ben Masi will say of at least two. One person is not enough to tilt the scales. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, so we'll say, just want to point out over here also, this is such an incredible idea. So right, there's a machlokes over here. The Tanakama said that even if there's one person who's tamei, he could tilt the scales. Rabbi Elazar ben Masya says, no, you can't, one person can't tilt the scales. We'll say, what a fundamental life machlokes. How much impact can one individual make? Right? Could one individual truly change Klal Yisrael or not? Rabbi Elazar says no. One individual is not capable of impacting that level of change. Tanakama says one individual can make all the difference in the world. I just say halacha l'maisa. How do we paskin? The Rambam paskins like the Tanakama, not like Rabbi Elazar ben Masya. One individual tilts the scales for the entire Klal Yisrael. One individual can make all of the difference in the world. In fact, the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva codifies this concept as well, that the Rambam says, Li'olam, a person should always view himself as Chetziav Zakai, Chetziav Chayiv, that my scales are exactly equal. A person should view the world's scales as exactly equal. And Lashon HaRambam quotes the Gemara. Lashon HaRambam is, therefore a person does one mitzvah, Hita es atzmo, ve'es kala olam kulo. A person goes ahead and does one mitzvah, he tilts his scales and the scales of the entire world. We pass like the Tanakama. One person can make all of the difference. Rabbi Shimon Omer, both sides is great. Rabbi Shimon says, second line, Pei Amud Aleph. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Afilu shevet echad tamei. This is great. I mean, even if one shevet is tamei and the rest are tar, so shar shal kol hashvatim torim halalu osin liatzman v'halalu osin liatzman. So we'll say it's very interesting. If one shevet is tamei but the rest are tahar, then Abba said we view that essentially as a case of mechza al mechza, right? That ultimately again the tamei shevet will do its carbon, and ultimately again the shvatim torim will do their carbon. My time of Rabbi Shimon, but say the Rambam doesn't accept this halacha l'maisa, but it's interesting. My time of Rabbi Shimon, kasavar shevet echad ikri kahal, because Rabbi Shimon says one shevet is called a kahal, right? One shevet is called an assembly. It's called klalis. It used to be called klalis. So Rashi calls the pasuk. It's called a kahal. So because of that, interestingly enough, when one shevet is tamei, that essentially becomes like a case of mechza al mechza. And also you begin to see that the Gemara seems to be adopting the position of Rav, that when you have mechza al mechza, 50% tar, 50% tamei, you have two different types of carbon pesach that are offered. So the tar group will do their carbon betara, the tamei group will do their carbon betuma. Rabbi Huda Omer, afilu shevet echad tamei, Ushar kol hashvatim torah. This is very dramatic. Rabbi Yehuda says no. If one shevet is tamei and everyone else is tar, yasu betuma. Wow. Well, say, watch this. If one shevet is tamei and all the other shvatim are tar, you offer up the carbon pesach betuma that year. Why? She'en carbon sibur chalak. See Rabbi say, Rabbi Yehuda in principle agrees with Rabbi Shimon. Right? Rabbi Shimon holds that halacha l'maisa, one shevet is called a kahal. One shevet is called Kal Yisrael. What comes on Rabbi Yehuda says, well, if one shevet is called Kal Yisrael, that means when one shevet is tamei, then what? It's not mechza. It's not mechza. What is it? Klal Yisrael is tamei. Well, if Klal Yisrael is tamei, then you offer up the carbon betuma. Pretty dramatic sheet, Rabbi. Say again, we don't adopt halacha l'maisa. Rabbi Yehuda savar shevet ikri. So Rabbi Yehuda holds shevet echad ikri kal. Babalu palga, then carbon sibur chaluk va'avdi kulhu betuma. So we'll see what they really also discuss. So again, Rabbi Yehuda will hold that one shevet is called the kal. Therefore, he holds this palga, obviously not adopting Rav's position of resolving a palga case. Carbon sibur can't be brought in two pieces. I will say this is what he's fundamentally arguing on also. He holds that halacha l'maisa, Klal Yisrael must go ahead and bring one type of carbon. It could be a carbon betuma, it could be a carbon betara, but it clearly rejects Rav's position that Klal Yisrael could bring two types of carbons. Right? But remember again, Rav held that in the case of mechza umechza, Klal Yisrael brings two different types of carbonos. So Rabbi Yehuda is obviously rejecting that. He holds Klal Yisrael could only go ahead and bring one type of carbon. And therefore, again, when one of the shvatim is going to be tamei, everybody will bring a Batuma. So the Gemara goes weiter, Itmar, Hayu Yisrael Mechza Torah Mechza Tzemeyin. If Klal Yisrael is 50% Tar, 50% Tamei, so Amarav, supposed to listen to this. This is great. So Rav says, Mitamin Echa Mehen B'Sheretz. We make someone Tamei. We make someone Tamei, Tumas Sheretz. Tumas Sheretz. So the Gemara says, and we'll say, now what does that do? What does that do? That way, see, so both say it sounds very wrong, right? It sounds very wrong. Now, both say, now understand why we want to do this. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says, "Metamen echa mehen ki hechid b'nei habu ruf tameim b'nei avdu kulu." See, both say, here's the problem. In a mechza al mechza case, we don't have a uniform approach about what to do, right? So therefore, again, this Gemara Rav is suggesting over here that essentially make one guy tamei. If you make one guy tamei tumas sheretz, the good news is that what? Assuming that we pass like the Tanakama, that one can establish a majority, you now have a majority of what? Of what? Of tamein, which means now what could happen? About say, what happens now when the majority is tamei? Everyone could bring the carbon, right? Again, everyone could bring carbon on Pesach Rishon. So the Gemara says, "V'amai ne'avdu hani lichudayu, hani lichudayu. Daha amarav halalu osin atzman, halalu osin atzman." But why do you need to do that? Rav just said before, Abba said that in a mechza case, everyone can bring the carbon on Pesach Rishon. The Tamein will bring their carbon b'tumah. The Tahorin will bring their carbon b'tara, and Shalom HaYisrael. So why do you have to make why do you have to make someone Tamei? To which the Gemara says, Hachamay askinan kegon shahayu Tamein otfin ala Tahorin echad. So we'll say, what's the case here? The case is where there is a majority of Tamein over Tahorin, but the majority is only a majority of one. Ihachi Havalu Ruva Tameim, Neavdu Kula B'tumah. But if that's the case again, then you have a majority of Tamein. Everybody should do the carbon B'tumah. Because apparently this price takes into account the opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Masya. And Rabbi Elazar ben Masya says you cannot have a majority of one. You can't have a majority of one. Therefore, again, I will say, really what we have over here is we have a majority of one who are Tamei. Now what the Bryce is saying is make one more guy Tamei Tumas Sheretz. This way again, you now have what? You now have what? A majority of two. Good. And that's enough to go ahead and allow the entire Kal to offer up a Betumah. To which the Gemara says, I don't understand. So we'll say, okay. Ihachi hadar kushin leduchtei ne'avdu hani lichudai v'hani lichudai. So again, I still don't understand. So if you have a majority of one, and you're going to tell me one is not enough to establish a majority. So you said, oh, what are we going to do? We'll make a second guy tamei. That way there is a tamei majority. Why? Rav already said before that essentially when you have a mechza case, which apparently according to Elazar ben Masi, even if you have a majority of one, that's still called mechza al mechza. Let everyone do the carbon pesach in their respective ways. Let the tar chaver do it b'tara. Let the tamei chaver do it b'toma. Why do you have to be matami a guy? Let's just will say elachi kamar. Ikatana the savarla kitana kama. Don't palgo lo avdi kulu b'toma. Because well, listen to this. If there's an opinion who holds that halacha lemaisa by palgo upalga by mechza you can't offer up a carbon b'toma. B'savarla Rabbi Yehuda. Damar ein carbon tzibor chaluk, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, he holds that the tzibor could only offer up one type of carbon. And if you accept both of those positions, then metame echad me'em b'sheretz. And halacha l'maisa, you would go ahead and be metame one person b'sheretz. So we'll say all the Gemara is doing over here is if you're mitzdarif, all of the more extreme shitas, the way to go ahead and rectify the situation is to go and be metame one individual to tilt the scales. And we'll say what's interesting about this is that the Gemara is entertaining this possibility that essentially if you're in a deadlock state, you can potentially resolve it, by being metame someone and actively tilting the scales in the favor of Tumah. But Ula says no. Ula says so we'll say according to this approach, where let's say you have to be metame someone in order to go in and tilt the scales, we don't need to be metame someone. Instead, what do? Ula Amar mishalchin echam ehem l'derech rechoka. Just send someone away. This is actually very interesting. What does it mean? Just send someone away. So I'll say so again. The idea would be, remember that in order to go ahead and be exempt from Pesach Rishon, there are two possibilities. You could be Tamei, or you could be B'derech Rechoka. too far away. So Ula says, what do you have to start being metame someone? Just send someone out of town. And that way, again, it effectively accomplishes the same thing. How does it accomplish the same thing? Because remember, if you're out of town, you don't count towards the tally of tahar people. So essentially what you'll do is you'll skew the numbers in the favor of the Tameyan without what? Without what? Actively being metame someone. So just send someone on an all-expense paid vacation out of town, and that way you accomplish the same thing. You don't have to make anyone tame. To which the Gemara says, but why does Ula suggest that? According to Ula, why is it's so much easier and cheaper to just be metame someone with the sheretz than go ahead and send them on an all-expense paid vacation? To which the Gemara says, Kasavar shoktun v'zarkin atame sheretz. Because Ula holds that halacha l'maisa, if somebody was tamei tumas sheretz, they could still go ahead and participate in Pesach. He holds, say, for our purposes now, we've always been operating that when the Torah speaks about tumah by Karban Pesach, it's referring to two types of tumah. Tumas sameis, tumas sheretz. Not other types of tumas we'll discuss. But halacha l'maisa, Ula holds that apparently tumas sheretz does not disqualify you for Karban Pesach. Now remember, you may not be able to eat of the karban, but halacha l'maisa, you can be part of the chabura. To which the Gemara says, v'yitamena b'meis. So then just make the guy tamei tumas meis, right? Take him on a field trip to a cemetery, right? Just take him to a beis hakbaros, be metame him like that. Because we'll say here's the problem: if you're metamiim tumas meis, let's remember again, what's the duration of tumas meis? 7 days. Tumas sheretz, 1 day. The beauty of tumas sheretz vis-a-vis Karban Pesach is if you're metamiim tumas sheretz, that essentially disqualifies him from Karban Pesach. Because right, you'll make him tamei on the 14th and Erev Pesach. He can't bring the karban. But the good news is, come the night of Pesach, he could become tahar, and therefore he still has the ability to bring his karban chagiga over the course of Pesach. Masha'in kain, if you go ahead and you're metamiim tumas meis, that is a 7-day tumah, and he will not only lose out on the opportunity to bring Pesach, but he'll also lose out on the opportunity to what? To bring his chagiga. To which the Gemara says, so the Gemara says, I'm sorry, but again, so I don't understand. You're worried about being metamim is going to lose out on the karban. When you're being metamim, he's going to lose out on his Pesach. What are you talking about? This is what we're talking about over here. You're being metamim him, and he doesn't have the ability to bring a karban. Here's the difference. The Gemara says, Efshar da'avid b'sheni. Ultimately, again, you're right. You're causing him to miss out on Pesach, but he has the privilege of the makeup date of Pesach Sheni. To which the Gemara says, "B'meis nami efshar da'avid b'shvi, da'avid shmini shalo." Both say, listen to this. Even if you're metami the guy tumas meis, he could still bring his chagiga. Both say, because remember again, when could he bring his chagiga? On the last day of Pesach. If you're metami him on Erev Pesach, that means again his tumah finishes on the 6th day of Pesach, and the last day of Pesach is the 8th day, his first post-tumah day. He can bring his chagiga on the last day of Pesach. So what's the problem? To which the Gemara says, Kasavar Ula, Kulu tashlumin derishoninhu, the chazi berishon, chazi bekulu, v'chol heichad delo chazi berishon, chazi bekulu. I will say it is true. You are allowed to bring your karban chagiga throughout the duration of Pesach. However, the way we look at this is as follows. The subsequent days of Yom Tov of Pesach are a tashlumin for the first day. You're supposed to bring your chagiga on the first day. If you didn't bring it the first day, you could bring it throughout the rest of Yom Tov. But I will say that only works if you are obligated in chagiga on the first day. But if you are tamei tumas meis, you're not obligated in the chagiga on the first day. And if you're not obligated on the first day, then what? There is no tashlumin for the rest of the days. An interesting idea. You could bring your chagiga as a tash. You can make up your chagiga over the duration of the Pesach, provided that you are obligated on day one. But if you are not obligated on day one, there is no tashlumin throughout the rest of Pesach. Pretty incredible. Amr Rav Nachman. So let's listen to this. This is very cute. Rav Nachman says, Zilu v'amr le'ula man tzayis de'akar sichei umashkene v'ra'ed. So Rav Nachman says, remember, so we'll say, so therefore Ula likes the idea of telling someone to go out of town. That way, they're out of town ultimately again on Erev Pesach. And halacha l'maisa, again, they help tilt the numbers. So Rav Nachman says, by the way, someone go tell Ula, who is going to listen to you? Literally to uproot his tent and to run out of town. In other words, so Nachman was saying it's much easier just to throw a sheretz at someone than it is to go ahead and get them to run out of town, because no one's going to listen to you to go ahead and uproot your tent and run out of town. Okay, interesting. So the Gemara says itmar, which is also interesting. Rather, you think about this for just a moment. That what does this mean? If you go to a guy and you say, listen, we need you to go ahead and go out of town for the benefit of Klal Yisrael, that Klal Yisrael could offer up a tumah. You see Abba saying that even when things are for very lofty purposes, if it's an inconvenience for a person, lav dafka, they're always going to do it. People are generally happy to help, but the moment that assistance becomes inconvenient for an individual, people think twice, even when it comes to something significant, an interesting window into human nature. So the Gemara goes weiter. Itmar, haya ruban zavin, umi utan tumei. So we'll say, now it's a party. Now we've got zavin. Right? So we'll say, so now remember again, up until now it was tamei tumas meis. Now we have tumas sheretz, and now we've got zavin. I will say, now again, what I want to point out is something very important over here. The Gemara is presupposing we know this fact, so let's discuss it. The halachos of Tuma, Hutra, or Duchuya B'tzibar for Kam Pesach. Right? The Boss said that we've established that 51% of the klal, if 51% of the klal is Tameh, then halacha l'mais, you offer up the carbon b'tuma. That does not apply to every form of Tuma. It only applies to Tumas Meis and Tumas Sheretz. So for example, if 51% of Klal Yisrael are Zavin, halacha l'mais said they do not offer up the carbon b'tuma. Now, what do they do in that situation? What do? Pesach Sheni. They obviously they're tamei, so you can't offer up the carbon. But the notion of 51% of Klal Yisrael being tamei and offering up carbon Pesach only applies to Tumas Meis and Tumas Sheretz. So we'll say, now here we go. Itmar haya ruban zavin umi utan tamei meisim. It's very interesting. If the majority, I will say, were Zavin and Mi'utan Tmei Mason. So I will say, so interestingly enough, I want to point out, in this case over here, everyone's Tamei. But I will say, but the majority of people are Tamei Tumas Zav, and the minority Tumas Meis. So Amarav, Osan Tmei Mesim, ain't Osan Lo B'Rishon V'Lo B'Sheni. So the Tmei Mesim can't do Pesach Rishon or Pesach Sheni. Why? B'Rishon Lo Avdi Dahavi Miuta, Umiuta Lo Avdi B'Rishon. So we'll say they can't do Pesach Rishon. Why? Because the Tumas Meis Chevra is a miut, is a minority. So they can't and you can't do Pesach B'Tumah if you're a minority. B'Sheni Nami Lo Avdi, they also can't do Pesach Sheni. Why? Kol Heicha Da Avdi B'Tzibar B'Rishon Avdi Yachid B'Sheni. Lo He Kol Heicha, first wide line. Kol Heicha Da Lo Avdi Tzibar B'Rishon Lo Avid Yachid B'Sheni. I will say this is incredible. The only time that Pesach Sheni is triggered is when the Kahal offered up a Pesach Rishon. Right? So it's incredible. So Pesach Sheni, let's remember, what is Pesach Sheni, its essence? Pesach Sheni is a makeup date for individuals. But the makeup date for individuals presupposes that what? That Klal Yisrael offered up a carbon on Pesach Rishon. But if Klal Yisrael didn't offer up a carbon Pesach on Pesach Rishon, then there is no makeup date for individuals on Pesach Sheni. We'll say, isn't that incredible? So therefore, in this case, where the majority are Zavin, the minority are Tmei Meis, they can't offer up on Pesach Rishon, because again, halacha l'maisa, you can only offer up a carbon b'tzibur if the majority of Klal Yisrael is Tamei Tumas Meis or Sheretz. So they can't do Pesach Rishon. And they can't do Pesach Sheni either. Why? Because it turns out in that year, there will be no carbon Pesach Rishon. So if there's no carbon Pesach Rishon for the cow, so therefore there's no makeup for Pesach Sheni. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Amr lehu Shmuel, zilu amr le Abba. So Shmuel said, go tell Abba, which is Rav, v'yasu b'nei Yisrael es ha-Pesach b'moado. How can you say that there's no Pesach Rishon? The Torah says you have to offer up a carbon Pesach. So you're telling me now, in this case, majority Zavin, minority Tmei Meis, that there's no Pesach. The Torah says you have to bring a carbon Pesach. Amr lahu, so Rav will say, go back and say to Shmuel, Zilu Amrulei, Ki havu kulu zavin maya v'ditalei. Let me ask you a question, Shmuel. And what happens if all of Klal Yisrael would be zavin? What happens then? So obviously, we'll say if everybody's zavin, we'll say what happens? What happens to Korban Pesach? What happens? What happens? No. Remember again. Well, actually, maybe yes. Maybe I shouldn't say no. Right? We'll say, but at least again for Pesach Rishon, nothing's happening in Pesach Rishon. So Shmuel says to Rav, I'm sorry. Rav says to Shmuel, what are you talking about? You see what I say? So Shmuel's all distressed. How could Rav say there's no Pesach Rishon? The Torah says you have to bring Pesach Rishon. To which Rav says, what are you talking about? There are, and if all of Klal Yisrael are zavin, does anybody offer up a Pesach Rishon? Of course not. The Torah says you have to bring a Pesach Rishon. Of course you have to bring a Pesach Rishon. We'll say, when do you bring a Pesach Rishon? When do you bring it? When you can. But if you have a Metzias that precludes that possibility, you don't bring it. Itmar, Hayu Ruban Tmei Masonly Utan Zavin. We'll say, so now watch this. This is the opposite case. Majority are Tmei Mace, minority are Zavin. Rafuna Amar Ein Tashlumin LePesach Haba B'Tumah. Wow. We're both saying now we're being introduced to something else. Remember, this case is easy, right? We got this case, right? So this is majority Tmei Mesim. So once I have majority Tmei Mesim, I'll say that's easy. Pesach Rishon is offered up B'Tumah. Easy. The Shail, of course, is the Zavin, can they go ahead and do Pesach Sheni? Rafuna says no. Rafuna says something fascinating. He says that halacha l'maisa, if Pesach Rishon was brought B'Tumah, there is no Pesach Sheni that year. No Pesach Sheni that year. Look at Rashi. Ein tashlum lePesach haba b'tumah. Ve'ein hazavin osin as Sheni afilu taruk. So we'll say this is incredible. What's Rafuna's logic? We'll say so. Rafuna's logic is very sound. What's the whole point of Pesach Sheni? What's the point of Pesach Sheni? It's a makeup date for what? Primarily for what? Well, it's for two things: either tamei or derech cholka. But Rafuna will say if the first Pesach was offered up b'tumah, there's no makeup date for Tumah, because the whole Pesach was brought B'Tumah. Therefore, Allah Chalamaysa is incredible. Rav Huna will say literally in a year where Pesach Rishon was brought B'Tumah, because 51% of Klal Yisrael was Tameh, there is no makeup date, there is no Pesach Sheni. Rav Adabar Ava Amar no. Yesh Tashum Pesach Haba B'Tumah. Rav Adabar Ava says that's not true. There's Pesach Sheni even when Pesach Rishon was brought B'Tumah. So maybe they're arguing about the following idea. The opinion who holds that there is no Pesach Sheni when Pesach Rishon was brought B'Tumah, Kasavar Tumah Dechuya Behi B'Tzibor, he'll hold ultimately again that Tumah is Dechuya B'Tzibor. It is set aside. It's not dispensed with, but rather again, it is set aside. Look at Rashi. Rav Huna Savar Tumah Dechuya B'Tzibor. So we'll say if you hold Tumah Dechuya B'Tzibor, that means we'll say we don't view this as suddenly again all the Tmeim became Tehorin. Rather, the Tmeim are Tmeim. And therefore we view it as if Pesach Rishon was offered up at Tumah. So if Pesach Rishon was offered up at Tumah, there is no Pesach Sheni for Tmeim. The Gemara says, Pesach. But the opinion of Adabar Ava who says no, that even when Pesach Rishon was offered up at Tumah, there is still Pesach Sheni. So the Gemara says, Kasavar Tumah Huchra B'Tzibor. He will say that when 51% of the klal is Tameh, but say amazingly enough, how do we view them? We view them as Tahorim. Tumah Huchra B'Tzibor. Right? When the Tzibor is Tameh, it's almost as if the laws of Tumah do not exist. Therefore, under those circumstances, we view it as if the Korban Pesach was actually offered up at Tara. And if the Korban Pesach was offered up at Tara, then what? Then in fact, there is a Pesach Sheni for those who were Tameh. Therefore, like the Zavin. Incredible. Amrilo. Not true. Everyone agrees Tumah Dechuya B'Tzibor. And therefore, also in 51% of the Klal is Tameh, and they offer up Pesach Rishon, we view that as a carbon being offered up at Tumah. So what's the machlokes here? Ubahapligi mar savar payment base mar savar tahara medachya tuma lo medachya umar savar afilu tuma nai medachya. We'll say look at Rashi tahara medachya tuma l'sheni ki avdi tzibur b'tara. We'll say really what they're arguing about is mechanics. That ultimately again what triggers Pesach Sheni. One opinion will say it's only Tara that ultimately propels the Tamein towards Pesach Sheni. So if there is no Tara, even by Pesach Rishon, then ultimately, again, no one is propelled towards Pesach Sheni. And ultimately, again, the other opinion will say, no, it's not true. It will say, what propels, what triggers Pesach Sheni? What triggers Pesach Sheni is an inability to offer Pesach Rishon. So in this case over here, although the carbon Pesach Rishon is being offered up at Tumah, halacha l'maisa, it still triggers Pesach Sheni for the Zavin who could not offer it up ultimately again by Pesach Rishon. So we'll say a very dramatic Gemara. So again, Machlokes Rav Huna and Rav Adabar Abba, that when you are offering up a Pesach Rishon Bitumah, let's say again 51%, the majority are Tzimei Meis, but you have a minority, have a different type of Tumah, can that minority do Pesach Sheni or not? Rav Huna, no. There is no Pesach Sheni for a Pesach Rishon that is offered up a Tumah. Rav Adabar Abba is saying, yes, there is. Good. So the Gemara goes weiter. Another case. Itmar, hayu shlishasan zavin ushlishasan tahorin ushlishasan tmei mesim. I was saying, now watch this. Now I will say you have Klal Yisrael divided up into thirds. 1/3 are zavin, 1/3 are tahorin, and 1/3 are tmei mesim. What do we do? Amar Amani Bar Patish Osen Tmei Mesim Einon Osen Loas Harishon Loas Hasheni. So we'll say the Tmei Mesim, they're stuck. They can't do Pesach Rishon or Pesach Sheni. Berishon Lo Avdi Higdilu Zavin Al Torin Lo Avdi Betuma. Havili Tmei Mesim Miuta Umiuta Lo Avdi Rishon. This is incredible. Why? Because watch this. For Pesach Rishon, I will say we view the Tahorin and the Zavim as one group, right? As one group. This is incredible. Why? Because here I will say, the Zavin don't really count towards the tally of Tmeim. Why? Because Tumas Zav does not help regarding Tuma Duchuya B'tzibur. So therefore, interestingly enough, when looking at the different segments, so the Tahorin and Zavin have more in common than the Tmeim and then the Zavin and the Tmei Mesim. So therefore, again, Higdilu Zavin al Tahorim, the Zavin combined with the Tahorin, the Avdi B'tuma, because neither of them have the ability to offer it up at Tuma. Havli Tmei Mesim Miuta. Therefore, the Tmei Mesim are a minority. Umiuta lo Avdi Berishon, and halacha l'maisa, a minority cannot offer up a Pesach B'tuma for Pesach Rishon. B'sheni nami lo Avdi, but also the Tmei Mesim can't offer it up on Pesach Sheni either. Why not? Nitzrefu Zavin and Tmei Mesim, the lo Avdi Berishon, because they both say now what will end up happening is as follows: that halacha l'maisa, the Zavin will combine with Tmei Mesim on Pesach Sheni, and it'll turn out that what? Because none of them offered up on Pesach Rishon, Havi they Ruba, and now they become a majority. The Ruba lo mitchu Pesach Sheni, and the majority of us can never offer up Pesach Sheni. So we'll say it's a pretty dramatic halacha. So we'll say, so what we end off with, again, we're not going to have time to do the halacha l'maisa today, but just hold on to these 2 points, which hopefully we'll get to in the next few days. Point number one, Rabbi say, is about this last case, about what happens when Pesach Rishon is offered up B'tumah. Is there still a Pesach Sheni or not? Machlokes Rav Huna and Rav Adabar Abba. We'll see what the Rambam has to say about that. Second, Rabbi say, the other machlokes we still have to clarify is the mechza al mechza machlokes. What happens when it's a 50-50 split in Klal Yisrael? Rav saying just offer up 2 karbanos, 1 karban matara, 1 karban matuma. Rav Kahana, 2 alternate versions of Rav Kahana, who we paskin like. So we'll say those are the 2 outstanding pieces of halacha l'maisa, which in Mirat Hashem we will get to in the next day. So Mishnah, Pesach Sheni Zakdama v'achar kach no the shutame. Let's listen to this interesting case. You have a Karban Pesach, regular year, regular Karban Pesach. You did Zrika, right? The Kohen did the Zrikas Hadam, and then what happens? V'achar kach no the shutame. And then I'll say finds out afterwards that in fact the Karban itself was Tameh. Either Rashi points out, either the Karban or the Dam. Some part of the Karban was Tameh, right? Again, either the Karban itself or the Dam. What's the halacha? Not a problem. Hatzitz miratza. The tzitz saves the day, and ultimately, you must remember that tzitz is able to go ahead and be mitaher sacrificial parts that were Tameh. Good. Nitma haguf. We'll see what happens if it turns out that it's not the Karban. The Karban was fine. I was Tameh, right? I, the owner, I was Tameh. So we'll say, so what's the halacha in this situation? Ena tzitz miratza. The tzitz cannot help in that case. Because we'll say again, so what you see over here is, we knew this already, the tzitz is able to be meratza. The tzitz is able to create effectiveness for sacrificial parts inadvertently offered up a tumah. The tzitz cannot help me, right? If I am tamei, if it turns out that I, the owner of the Karban Pesach, I was tamei, that the tzitz cannot help with, and the carbon will be ineffective. Because they said hanazir va'osa Pesach, both for the sacrificial part, the offering, the kabbalah of a nazir, or Karban Pesach, hatzitz miratz al tumas hadam. The tzitz could go ahead and help if the dam, if the blood, or for that matter, any of the sacrificial parts were tamei. So we'll say again, if any parts of the carbon, the dam, or any sacrificial parts were tamei, I didn't know about it, were inadvertently tamei, but they were offered up. The tzitz affects atonement. The ein hatzitz miratz al tumas haguf, but the tzitz cannot affect or cannot create effectiveness if the owner was tamei. Nitma tumas hatahom. What happens if halacha l'maisa, the individual became tamei with tumas hatahom? So hatzitz miratza, the tzitz is able to affect atonement. Now, I both say there's two different versions as to what exactly this tumas hatahom is. So according to Rashi, tumas tahom means tumas safek. Tumas safek. There's two versions in Rashi. The first version, tumas tahom, I will say, means like tuma in a situation where we would have never expected to find tuma. Again, we'll clarify this in a bit. But Rashi goes with the approach that tumas tahom is really tumas safek. Any case where there was a potential exposure to tuma, but it's a safek case. We'll see. Rosa, let's go. Says the Gemara, Taima din Nizrak. So we'll say, let's analyze the first case. Right? The first case is, I'm offering on my Karban Pesach, the Kohen did the Zrika, and then somehow they found out that, let's say, the blood was tamei. The blood was tamei. So what's the halacha? The Mishnah says the Karban Pesach is effective, it's kosher, because the tzitz is meratza. Taima din Nizrak va'achar kach noda. The reason why this works, I will say, is because Zrika was done first, and then only afterwards, did I find out that the blood was tamei. So ex post facto, the tzitz is meratza. Aval noda the achar kach nizrak. But I will say, for example, if I knew the blood was tamei, but the Kohen still went ahead with the zrika, then lo meratza. Then I will say, it sounds like from the Mishnah, it doesn't work. In other words, the tzitz could only be meratza ex post facto. But if I knew ahead of time that the dam was tamei, the tzitz would not work. The Gemara says, that's true. Or minore is a kasha, ama tzitz meratza, al hadam va'al habasra va'al achilef shenitma, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, bein ba'onis, bein b'ratzon, bein b'yachid, bein b'tzibur. Right, so I will say, it makes it sound like over here, what does it mean, shogeg and mezid? It makes it sound like whether I knew the blood was tamei, I didn't know the blood was tamei, the tzitz is meratza, which makes it sound like over here, the tzitz could create effectiveness for the dam, even if I knew that the blood was tamei from the outset. To which the Gemara says, no. Tumaso, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid. Hurtza. I will say what it means is like this. If the dam became tamei, whether it became tamei accidentally or intentionally, so ultimately, again, the blood service could be rendered effective through the tzitz. Zrikaso, b'shogeg hurtza, b'mezid lo hurtza. But I will say, when it comes to the actual zrika, in other words, I will say, if the blood became tamei intentionally, then enachinami, if the zrika was done unintentionally, the tzitz is meratza. But if the zrika was done intentionally with blood which was tamei, that does not work. The tzitz is not meratza. So I will say that's the opinion of Ravina. Rav Shila Amar, no, zrikaso bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid hurtza. Not true. The zrika, whether you did the zrika intentionally or unintentionally, as well as say, even if you knew that the dam was tamei and you did the zrika anyway, the tzitz is meratza. Tumasa b'shogeg hurtza, b'mezid lo hurtza. I will say, but it only works for blood that became accidentally tamei. But if the sacrificial blood or sacrificial meat was made intentionally tamei, then Allah say again, the tzitz is not meratza that. Ella had diktani bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid. So what does it mean when it says bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid? The Gemara says hachi ka'amar nitma b'shogeg. If the blood, this is according to Rav Shila. If it became tamei b'shogeg, b'zarku bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid hurtza. And again, you went ahead and you sprinkled it, or you did this zrika bein b'shogeg b'mezid, it works. I v'hodik tani damshin izrak v'achar kach noda. But I will say, but it said halacha l'maisa again. If you sprinkled the blood and then only afterwards found out that it was tamei, this is the statement of the Mishnah. Taimod din izrak v'achar kach noda. The only reason it works is because you did this zrika first and only then you found out. Aval noda v'achar kach zara lo. I will say, it sounds like from the Mishnah that if you knew that the dam was tamei, but you did zrika anyway, that would not work. To which the Gemara says no. The truth is, even if you knew the dam was tamei and you did zrika anyway, it would still work. So why does the Mishnah say that it was sprinkled and then you found out? Because it will say he needs to contrast it with the latter case, which is if the owner was tamei, the tzitz does not affect atonement. Because we'll say in that case, even if the zrika was done, and only afterwards the owner found out that he was tamei, the tzitz is not meratza. Therefore, katani reisha nami nizrak va'achar kach noda. Therefore, for textual symmetry, the reisha uses the same lashon. So I will say what we end off with over here is again another dramatic machlokes between Ravina and Rav Shila. That under what circumstances can the tzitz be meratza? According to Ravina, the only way it works, whether the blood became tamei, b'mezid or b'shogeg, doesn't matter. What does matter according to Ravina? The zrika must be done b'shogeg. If the zrika was done b'mezid, the tzitz is not meratza. Rav Shila says no, just the opposite. Whether or not the zrika was done b'shogeg or b'mezid doesn't matter. The tzitz is meratza. What matters is how did the blood become tamei. If the blood became tamei b'mezid, the tzitz is not meratza. But if it became tamei b'shogeg, even if the zrika was done b'mezid, then the tzitz is meratza. I will say again, we're going to add that to our list of machloksim for which we still need resolution. Shkoyach.